Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to talk about the difference between systemic and systematic. Those can be oftentimes confused and very confusing. So let's look at the difference. Here's an article by Grammar Girl, and I'm going to read the definitions to you from Grammar Girl. Systematic is the much older of the two words and the more common word. It arose in English in the 1670s, and it describes something that is thorough and intentional. This is important. Methodical or implemented according to a plan. Doctors began a systematic treatment plan. Ending systematic discrimination is a worthy goal. So for something to be systematic, it has to be thorough and intentional, methodical, meaning there's a method to it, or implemented according to a plan. Now let's look at systemic. Systemic entered English much later in the early 1800s, and it seemed as if it was first coined by doctors to describe something that happens or exists throughout a whole biological system, like the whole nervous system or even a patient's whole body. He has a systemic infection. Systemic also has a special meaning in the plant world, where it can describe a type of pesticide that is safe for the plant itself, but makes the entire plant poisonous to pests. These so-called systemic pesticides are water-soluble, so they are usually applied to the soil and are then taken up by all the parts of the plant as it sucks up the water. Finally, systemic has taken on a broader meaning outside of medicine and biology to describe something that exists in multiple parts of an entire system, like a government or business sector. That's important because it exists in multiple parts of an entire system. For example, Barron's reported in April that the Fed had averted a systemic financial crisis. And Reuters reported a few weeks ago that multiple people working the Italian healthcare system had been arrested because systemic corruption has allowed very large illicit profits. Let's look at the difference. Systematic versus systemic. There can be some overlap. A problem can be both systemic and systematic. If you wanted to say that something is methodical, organized, and intentional, so on purpose, call it systematic. If you want to say something is widespread and affects many parts of something, call it systemic. So again, if something is methodical, so thought out, there's logic behind it, there's a method behind it. Now, again, the logic doesn't have to make sense to others, but someone thinks it's logical, or it's organized and intentional, done on purpose. Call it systematic. Just like think of automatic, right? It's automatic because they've put everything in place for it to be automatic. So it's systematic. If you want to say something is widespread and affects many parts of something, call it systemic. Systemic. So here's the difference between systematic versus systemic. On the Jamboard on the screen, if you are live in class, make sure that you note the similarities and differences between the two. Grammar Girl pointed out that sometimes they overlap. So where do they overlap? What are some things that they have in common? And then what are these differences on the outside? Now let's talk about systemic discrimination. So the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has given a definition of systemic discrimination, and it reads as such. Systemic discrimination involves a pattern or practice, policy, or class case where the alleged discrimination has a broad impact on an industry, profession, company, or geographic area. So it has a broad impact. It's not going to just affect one individual, right? The impact is broad, it's overarching. The EEOC encourages employers to prevent discrimination by taking a careful look at the practices they use to recruit, hire, promote, train, and retain employees. The EEOC is expanding its efforts to partner with advocacy groups, state and federal agencies, employer groups, the plaintiffs' bar, and other organizations to identify and address discriminatory practices. Examples of systemic practices include discriminatory barriers in recruitment and hiring, discriminatorily restricted access to management trainee programs and to high-level jobs, exclusion of qualified women from traditionally male-dominated fields of work, disability discrimination, such as unlawful pre-employment inquiries, age discrimination and reductions in force and retirement benefits, and compliance with customer preferences that result in discriminatory placement or assignments. That definition right there is super helpful to us because it leads us to think about different areas that discriminations happen in a systemic fashion, right? We talked about higher level jobs. It talked about women. It talked about those with disabilities. It talked about age discrimination. And it talked about customer preferences. Those are all areas where systemic discrimination can lie. The EEOC has long recognized that a strong nationwide systemic program is critical to fulfilling its mission of eradicating discrimination in the workplace. For this reason, the systemic program is a top priority of the agency. The identification, investigation, and litigation of systemic discrimination cases, along with efforts to educate employers and encourage prevention, are integral to the mission of the EEOC. So systemic discrimination is when discrimination takes place widely against a group of people, right? And it's affecting the whole system. Discrimination can, of course, happen to individuals, but systemic discrimination is on a larger scale where we're seeing that discrimination take place and affecting more than just one person. Go ahead and click on the rubric as you're following along. So the rubric here is similar, exactly the same actually, to Unit 1. We're focusing on the same writing skills. And today our goal is going to be to demonstrate those writing skills in a pre-writing assessment using the question we will be given at the end of Unit 2. So first, let's look at the rubrics. What are they looking for? The first skill is focus and exposition. Do you have a clear stance or topic that you're talking about? And how are you exposing it, right? Exposition. How are you keeping our focus on that topic as a reader? Development is the next one. How are you developing your points? Are you providing facts and examples? And are you weaving them into your argument? It is not enough to just throw quotes into your paper, but you can develop your claims by using quotes or examples that you have and working them into the argument. The next piece on the rubric is organization and cohesion. How are things organized and cohesive, meaning they work together nicely? Make sure that you're using those transitions. That's super important to organization of your paper. Also, when you have multiple parts of a question, be sure that you're following all of the question aspects in that order so that you have a logical sense of organization to the paper. Then there's conclusion. Are you summarizing your points and leaving the reader feeling as if they are satisfied with understanding not only what your point was, but possibly a charge that they have to take in terms of systemic discrimination? Conventions. Conventions is next on the rubric. These are going to be your mechanics and your English conventions. This is going to include your punctuation, your capitalization, your paragraphing, your MLA format. A multitude of conventions will be taken into consideration. Be sure that you're reading your paper through before submitting it to a teacher. And last but not least, blending of purposes. We're going to work on this more throughout the marking period when we introduce more purposes. But for the purpose of this unit, we're going to inquire and explore. We're going to inform and explain. We're going to analyze and interpret. And we're even going to take a stand and propose a solution. So we have 4 wonderful purposes behind us under our tool belt that we can blend together to use essentially as one to make our paper as best as we can for this unit. All right, you're all set to go. Make sure that you're doing your writing pre-assessment for Unit 2 today. And when you're done, be sure to self-evaluate using the rubric provided. All assignments, including the rubric, are provided in all 3 languages that our class needs, both English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Let me know if you have any questions.